What is up, ladies, gentlemen, and my NB friends? I'm Paul, the Commander Theorist, and I'd like to take a moment to just thank you for allowing me your time today to present to you this Commander Theorem video. If this is your first time watching one of my videos, feel free to click that subscribe button to join the family. You can also ring the bell icon to make sure you get notifications whenever I release a new video, as YouTube's notification system isn't quite the best. In this episode, I want to talk about one of my favorite decks. It's a deck that, for the longest time, I wanted it to be a reality, but unfortunately, there wasn't a viable commander to make it possible. But in 2016, with the release of the 4-color commander decks, I got my wish. The non-red deck Breed Lethality opened the gates to my favorite strategy in Magic, +1/+1 counters. Now you might be asking yourself, Paul, my love, we already have plenty of commanders who deal in +1/+1 counters. There's Gave, one of the best combo machines in the game, Azuri Claw of Progress, and then Varolz. Why can't you just build one of those? Well, my friends, the problem with those commanders is their color access is always lacking one aspect of the deck I want. Gave is great, but he doesn't have access to blue, so cards like Master Biomancer and the Fathom Mage are a complete no-go. Azuri is nice, but he's too heavily reliant on small creatures, and having no access to black, we don't have Corpsejack Menace. And of course, I love my Golgari colored commanders, and I have had a great many games with Skullbriar the Death Metal Master, but I've yearned for the perfect build of +1/+1 counters that has all 4 colors. Here we have Breed Lethality. The deck features 4 of the 5 colors, omitting red, and to my great pleasure, focusing on those +1/+1 counters. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the Precon deck Breed Lethality is one of the best Precon builds out of the 2016 series. But you already know about that, and because of this, among other reasons, Atraxa Praetor's Voice, the cover card for this deck, is the most popular commander of all time, according to the EDH Rec data. But we're not here to talk about Atraxa. In fact, in my build of the deck, she's not even in it. I am talking to you today instead about the partner pairing of Ishai, Ojutai Dragonspeaker, and Reyhan, Last of the Abzan. These 2 partner commanders offer us the same color access as Atraxa, but come with a substantially greater impact on the strategy we are going for, and without the stigma that playing an Atraxa deck might bring. Now, we are still playing a non-red deck, but I choose Reyhan and Ishai over other combinations such as Thrasios and Tymna, largely because while they are a very powerful combination of commanders, they don't quite synergize with the deck nearly as well. But I will still say that they offer a far more competitive build than the one we're going to be discussing in this video. But enough about that, let's talk counters. Let's begin by taking an in-depth look at what these 2 commanders will do. I'll begin with Reyhan, as she is the more synergistic of the 2. Reyhan costs 1 mana of any color, and then 1 each of black and green. She enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on her. Whenever a creature you control either dies or returns to the command zone, if it had any +1/+1 counters on it, you may then put that many counters onto a target creature. This addresses one of the primary weaknesses that this deck had prior. Rather than going wide with a massive army of little creatures, this build wants to have less creatures, but larger creatures. So investing so much into just a single creature can be risky, as merely a single removal spell normally spells game over for all of those counters. But while Reyhan is in play, you can recycle those counters by putting them onto another creature. And since this includes herself, as when she dies, she can then be returned to the command zone, her 3 +1/+1 counters can then be moved onto another creature. Next is Ishai, Ojutai Dragonspeaker. Ishai doesn't quite do so much in line with synergizing with the other creatures in the deck, but she does offer us access to both white and blue for the color access, and she does stand to be a huge threat on her own. Being a 1/1 is extremely deceptive, as with every spell our opponents cast, she'll then get another +1 counter on her. And since she has flying, she has excellent evasion. She's great to dump a ton of counters onto and then swing in to deal immense amount of damage. For this deck, my usual style will involve dropping Reyhan first, and then later on playing Ishai. You want to get that ability of Reyhan on the battlefield as soon as you start dropping the big creatures, as once they start bulking up, the risk of losing them will grow. Moving on to the rest of our spellbook, we do have 3 main categories for what we run. We have spells that deal with putting +1/+1 counters on them, we have spells that care about those counters being on creatures in order to do things, and then we have, of course, our mana ramp package. Perhaps my favorite creature in the deck is the Bloodspore Thrinax. This little lizard 2/2 has Devour 1, which lets you sacrifice as many creatures as you'd like as it enters the battlefield, and then you put an additional +1/+1 counter onto the Thrinax for each creature you sacrificed. So if, say, you sacrifice 3 creatures, it gets 3 counters. The best card to sack for this, in my opinion, is Reyhan, as her 3 +1/+1 counters can then be dropped as additional counters onto the Thrinax. But the Thrinax has a second ability that is where this is very important. Each other creature that enters the battlefield after the Thrinax gets an additional amount of counters placed on it equal to the number of counters on the Thrinax. So if you just sacrifice Reyhan, and placing Reyhan's 3 +1/+1 counters onto the lizard in addition to the one it puts on itself for the Devour, each of your new creatures gets an additional 4 +1/+1 counters on it right off the bat, and that'll take even the tiniest of creatures in this deck up to being sizable threats. Now, along those same lines, the Master Biomancer also gives counters to new creatures, but this one is equal to its current power, which without any other benefit is just 2. You drop more counters onto the Biomancer, and suddenly your creatures will start coming out even larger, not to mention if the Thrinax is also hanging around the battlefield. Kathar's Crusade is a crazy good enchantment that gives you counters whenever a creature enters the battlefield. This can quickly add up as you play more and more creatures, is definitely a card to look out for on turn 5. Juniper Order Ranger is next, which is another 5-drop that also puts +1/+1 counters on your creatures. This one puts 1 on any new creature that enters your battlefield, and then it puts 1 on itself, so it can get pretty big on its own as you drop more stuff. Vigor is a personal favorite of mine, being sort of a pet card in a lot of my green decks. This is a very powerful card that I feel is vastly underestimated. Whenever a creature you control other than Vigor is dealt damage, any kind of damage, instead, you put that many +1/+1 counters on it instead. This is an innocuous ability that in fact gives your creatures an unbeatable edge in combat. Suddenly, your opponents cannot kill your creatures in combat. Death Touch is completely nullified as the damage it needs to deal in order to destroy your creatures is then replaced by a power buff. This can make blocking your board extremely disadvantageous and will likely make it the target of removal. Oh wait, whenever it's sent to the graveyard, it just shovels back into your library. Neat! Next, we have 2 cards that are very similar in function, the Deep Glow Skate and Colonian Hydra. Both have the ability to double the amount of counters on the board, though the Skate has the ability to target more than just +1/+1 counters. The Colonian Hydra's ability triggers upon attacking, so whenever it attacks, it doubles the counters on every creature you control. Both of these spell trouble for opponents as a large board can become even larger. And of course the Hydra has trample, so take that trouble and make it double. We have a few cards that will increase the number of counters we are placing. Hardened Scales is the cheapest as a 1-drop enchantment that increases your counter output by 1. So if you were to put, say, 4 counters on a creature, you instead place 5. Corpsejack Menace doubles the counter output, which can be deadly when we start moving a lot of counters around, and of course everyone's favorite doubling season doubles, well, everything. These cards will really help ramp out the counters plopping onto creatures, and will quickly make things get out of hand. Forgotten Ancient and Managorger Hydra are both small innocuous creatures that, for every spell that are cast after they're chilling on the board, they get a counter. With the Ancient, we have the ability during our upkeep to move any number of counters from it to any other creatures. This is very nice as we can stockpile counters to then shift onto whoever is the tiniest creature at that particular moment. Also keep in mind those doublers will love having this thing moving counters around. Next is the Fathom Mage, one of my favorite engines in the deck. She has Evolve, which gives her a counter whenever something larger than her comes into the battlefield. She also gives you a card draw whenever a counter is placed on her, so the more counters we can place on the Fathom Mage, the more cards we're going to draw. Speaking of card draw, Prime Speaker Zigana comes in with counters equal to the power of whatever the largest creature we control at that time is. We then draw cards equal to Zigana's power. And given that she will always be the largest creature in play after she's played, in a deck focused on making big creatures bigger, we're going to draw a lot of cards off of her. Champion of Lambhold is great at getting our damage through. We can put counters on her either through her own ability or through other methods that this deck has, and then creatures your opponents control can't block our creatures if they're smaller than the champion. Now, if for some reason we are attacked by a great deal of creatures, we do have a backup plan. The Selfless Squire, my favorite hand trap creature, has the potential to save us from a lethal strike. She's got flash, and when she enters the battlefield, you'll get a fog effect for that turn. But not only that, should damage be prevented, say if your opponent swings for 50 points of damage while the Squire hits the play, all that damage is then converted into counters that are placed on the Squire. So she's pretty handy for being a retaliation strike. Now, we have plenty of cards that can get counters onto our creatures, but let's make more use of them through some of our other creatures. The Khans of Tarkir block brought with it a series of cards from the Abzan family that offer abilities to creatures with counters on them. We run a few that will help give them evasion and combat prowess. The Abzan Falconer gives flying, the Tuskar Adapton gives trample, Einok Bondkin gives first strike, and the Abzan Battle Priest gives lifelink. I don't care so much that these creatures all have Outlast, which can give them a counter on their own. Their benefit comes the most from having a board-wide keyboard ability. Ixalan's Herald of Streams is also great here, giving creatures with counters on them flat out unblockable. And to give us another instance of Reyhan's recycling counter ability, we've included Death's Presence in the deck as well. That pretty much wraps up our crucial spellbook package, but of course, you will want to run removal spells and toolbox cards to fill out your arsenal. To see our full list, you can check out that first link in the description to see the full tapped out deck list. I don't want to bore you all by explaining for the umpteenth time why you should be running Teferi's Protection or Cyclonic Rift. You know they're good. But instead, I do want to touch upon a few key ramp-based spells for our deck. Being in 4 colors makes it very tricky to get the colors you need right away. I wanted to go with a relatively budget-friendly mana base, so we're not running any original dual lands, but we have several cards that synergize with the deck strategy while giving us mana ramp. Crystalline Crawler actually came in the pre-con deck, and it has Converge, but gives it a +1/+1 counter for each color mana used to cast it. In this deck, you can easily get 4 counters or even 5 on it when it first hits the battlefield. You can then remove a counter, and for each counter you remove, you add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. You throw a ton of counters onto this, and you can easily ramp up a ton of mana. And given that it's originally a 1/1 creature, you'll never have to worry about removing all of its counters to kill it. Next is Gyre Sage, a veritable powerhouse in this deck in terms of mana ramp. Like the Fathom Mage, this elf has evolved, making it bigger the larger of creatures you play. It also lets you add a green mana for each counter on it, so if you load this little elf up on counters, you'll be generating a lot of green mana. Realm Seekers came in the Kianios and Tiro Precon, but I do feel it does so much better in this deck. It comes in with counters equal to the total number of cards in every player's hand. So if you're in a 4-player game and each player has 4 cards in their hand, this thing hits the battlefield with 16 +1/+1 counters on it. Yikes. You can also pay 3 mana and then remove a counter on it to tutor a land card to your hand. Note this tutor ability does not specify basic lands, making it possible to get any land that you may need. And lastly, we do have Fertilid, who enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. Similar to the Realm Seekers, you can then remove a counter to have target player tutor for a basic land, and that is then put into play tapped. You're restricted to basics with this one, but you do have the ability to give the ramp to another player if you're feeling generous. The main strategy of this deck is to start dropping big creatures early and start piling on those counters. This is not only going to give you huge creatures to attack opponents with, but on the defense, it'll ensure that your creatures can effectively block the oncoming attacks. It's a very Timmy and straightforward strategy, and with the backup of our removal spells and the combat prowess, we should easily be able to outclass our enemies. Now, for the lands to put into this deck, cards like Gavany Township, Oran Reef the Vastwood, and Novagent Heart of Progress are all great options to synergize with putting counters on creatures. I would keep to a minimum amount of utility lands due to the color intensity that this deck requires, and having too many lands that only produce colorless mana can become very cumbersome to getting your game rolling. I recommend running all the shock lands in your colors, maybe 5 on-color fetch lands, some dual lands such as the City of Brass that will give you all of the colors, the mandatory Command Tower, Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. I personally love running Rogue's Passage to ensure damage on the biggest attack gets through. And while my usual deck building techniques do not favor running a lot of lands that have to enter the battlefield tapped, I choose to include Sandstep Citadel as the primary colors in this deck are black, white, and green, and this card provides all 3. You can of course add in more cards of your own choice and tune the deck's mana base further, but I don't think you need to go as crazy as to include things like the original dual lands. Now, to end this Commander Theorem video, I do have some recommendations for other videos you might like to view for additional resources. Deck builds for this specific brew are not quite as common on YouTube as those of, say, Atraxa, likely in part due to her overshadowing popularity. I feel the build by TheArtofDeckbuilding is a very similar style than for what I went for here, and I definitely recommend her video if you're wanting to see another take on these commanders. I also recommend On the Stacks video of Najeela and Reyhan Ishai versus Valduk and Galta, as well as MTGConnect's Episode 5, Freya versus Atraxa versus Tana and Timna versus Reyhan and Ishai, for some gameplay videos featuring these commanders. Of course, links for these videos will be in the description of this video, so go check them out. That will conclude our look at Ishai and Reyhan. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, I hope you'll give this video a like, so that others may know it's worth a watch. Feel free to share this video with your Commander playgroup to maybe bring a new brew to the table. And remember, if you're new to the channel, to subscribe with notifications. If you'd like to help the channel up the ante in terms of our quality, we do have an ongoing Patreon you're more than welcome to check out, and I am very grateful for every bit of support this channel receives. I'm on Twitter and Facebook, feel free to check those links out, and once again, I want to thank you for your time in viewing this video. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you rockstars in the next Theorem.